Iran's state media now claims that that country's Navy has prevented the U.S. military and U.S. military ships from entering the Strait of Hormuz.
At 0347 local time on a Thursday in late March, two B-2 Spirit stealth bombers lifted off from Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean and turned northwest toward Iran. Each aircraft carried two GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators in its weapons bay. Each weapon weighs approximately 30,000 pounds, costs approximately $3.5 million, and is designed to do one specific thing: reach the places that were never supposed to be reachable. The total payload those two aircraft carried into Iranian airspace that morning was worth $14 million. The target it was meant to destroy had cost an estimated $12 billion and 12 years to build. Iran was about to find out that math does not work in its favor. The story starts 5 months earlier, on a surveillance deck aboard the USS Bataan, where a radar operator was staring at something that didn't belong. It was October 14, 2025, when 9 signals blinked into existence along the Iranian coastline near the Strait of Hormuz and then vanished.
2 seconds on, 4 seconds off,
reappearing in a slightly different position each time. The operator had seen IRGC coastal radar activity before. Everyone who'd spent time in the Fifth Fleet had. The Iranians monitored the strait constantly, obsessively, the way a nervous shopkeeper checks his locks every 20 minutes. But this was different. These signals weren't oriented toward the water. They were pointed inland, toward the mountains of Hormozgan province, roughly 40 kilometers from the coastline, and they were emitting on frequency bands that had no business being associated with coastal defense. He flagged it. The report went up the chain. And then he went back to watching, because the signals kept appearing, kept vanishing, and kept not making sense. Here is the first thing you need to understand about air defense radars. They protect things. That is their entire operational purpose. When you position a sophisticated radar network around an empty mountain, you are telling anyone with the sensors to detect it that the mountain is not empty. American satellites were retasked within days. Orbital parameters were adjusted to increase coverage frequency over Hormozgan province. Synthetic aperture radar, which can detect terrain disturbances invisible to optical cameras by measuring the way surfaces reflect microwave energy, began building a picture that no conventional satellite could have provided on its own. And that picture was extraordinary. Beneath the surface of what Iranian topographic surveys recorded as undeveloped terrain, the synthetic aperture imaging revealed a tunnel network stretching for more than 19 kilometers.
Not a single tunnel, a system.
Multiple parallel bores connected by cross passages, with at least 7 points where the tunnel diameter expanded dramatically, suggesting chambers large enough to shelter vehicles and weapons systems of substantial size. Ventilation shafts, disguised on the surface as natural rock formations or covered with vegetation netting, dotted the hillsides at irregular intervals. Thermal imaging during nighttime passes detected heat plumes consistent with diesel generator exhaust emanating from 3 locations that had no surface structures whatsoever. This was not a defensive bunker. The dimensions, the layout, the thermal signatures, everything pointed toward a single conclusion. Iran had built an offensive missile complex within striking distance of the world's most critical maritime choke point, and they had built it in a location that no Western intelligence agency had ever identified. What nobody knew yet was how long it had been there. Archival satellite imagery pulled from databases stretching back more than a decade eventually provided the answer. Construction signatures first appeared in 2013.
Subtle ones.
A temporary access road that existed for 8 months and was then erased. A pattern of heavy vehicle tracks during winter months when rain softened the ground enough to leave impressions visible from orbit. A slight color change in rock spoil on a hillside, material matching the geological composition of subsurface strata, meaning someone had been excavating from below and depositing the waste on the surface. Over 12 years, the IRGC had carved an entire weapons complex into the Hormozgan Mountains, moved operational missile systems into it, and done all of this without triggering a single alarm anywhere in the Western intelligence apparatus. Until a radar operator on the Bataan watched 9 signals blink on a frequency band that didn't belong on a coastline. Discovery is not the same as understanding. Knowing a tunnel system exists tells you nothing about what it contains, how deep it runs, or where its structural weak points are. The GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator is a 30,000-pound guided penetrating weapon that works on a simple principle. No warhead in the conventional sense. The weapon itself is the warhead. 17 feet of hardened steel carrying 5,300 pounds of high explosive, accelerating to over 1,000 feet per second before impact and then drilling through rock until a programmable fuse detonates it at a pre-calculated depth. Think of it as dropping a guided steel pillar out of the sky and letting physics do the rest.
A B-2 can carry 2.
Whiteman Air Force Base to Iran and back requires 30 hours in the air and multiple aerial refueling contacts. Diego Garcia cuts the transit to roughly 4 hours in each direction. The decision to stage from Diego Garcia was not about convenience. It was about precision. Every atmospheric variable that could affect weapon guidance over the Strait of Hormuz, humidity, thermal layering, barometric pressure, was modeled and accounted for. The weapons had to arrive within a 4-hour window when conditions were optimal. The math demanded Diego Garcia. But before any of that could happen, the intelligence community needed something that took months to assemble: geological certainty. Geologists at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency analyzed every available data source on the rock composition of Hormozgan province. Historical mining surveys, academic studies published in Iranian scientific journals, decades of satellite spectral imaging. The mountain range in question was composed primarily of limestone and dolomite in the upper layers, transitioning to harder metamorphic rock at greater depths. This mattered because a GBU-57's fuse must be programmed to detonate at a specific depth after impact, and that calculation depends entirely on what the weapon is penetrating. Limestone fractures differently than granite. Dolomite absorbs blast pressure differently than sandstone. Detonate too early, and you collapse the entrance but leave the deeper chambers intact. Detonate too late, and the weapon's kinetic energy is exhausted before the explosive reaches the target. Getting the depth right required knowing the mountain from the inside out. Simultaneously, signals intelligence teams were dissecting every electronic emission from the complex. Communications intercepts revealed a command structure reporting directly to the IRGC Aerospace Forces Missile Command, not to the regular Iranian military. Personnel movements were tracked by correlating cell phone metadata with known IRGC officers. Vehicle traffic patterns established resupply schedules. The facility drew power from the Iranian national grid through a connection officially allocated to a water treatment plant that, upon investigation, did not exist. The power consumption patterns were consistent with heavy industrial equipment operating on a regular maintenance cycle.
Missile maintenance.
Possibly assembly. Possibly pre-launch preparation. By January 2026, the intelligence picture was detailed enough to build targeting packages. And what those packages revealed was worse than the initial assessment. The Hormozgan complex was not a storage site. It was a fully operational missile base capable of independent launch operations. The 7 enlarged chambers corresponded to launch preparation areas, spaces where transporter erector launcher vehicles could be loaded, armed, and driven directly out through concealed exits onto pre-surveyed firing positions in the hills above the strait. The tunnels were wide enough to accommodate the largest vehicles in Iran's inventory, including those designed to carry the Khalij Fars anti-ship ballistic missile. The Khalij Fars is not a crude weapon. Built on the Fateh 110 short-range ballistic missile platform, it incorporates an electro-optical seeker in its terminal phase that identifies and tracks individual ships on the water below. Its range of approximately 300 kilometers means that launchers in the Hormozgan mountains could target vessels throughout the entire Strait of Hormuz and well into the Gulf of Oman. Its warhead weighs over 600 kilograms. A single hit on a supertanker would be catastrophic. Multiple hits on a warship could be fatal. The strait at its narrowest point is 33 kilometers wide. 21 million barrels of oil pass through it every day. A battery of Khalij Fars missiles launching from tunnels in those mountains, striking tankers, burning them, blocking the waterway, would not close the strait symbolically. It would close it physically, and it would take months to reopen. This was the capability Iran had threatened the world with for 4 decades. Now the United States had its exact address. The strike plan that emerged from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency's targeting cell was unlike any previous application of the GBU-57. Previous employment concepts used each bomb as an independent weapon aimed at a discrete chamber or tunnel section. The Hormozgan plan used 4 bombs as components of a single weapon system, a geological demolition tool that would leverage the mountain's own mass against the tunnels carved into it. Military engineers working alongside geologists identified the tunnel junctions where the main bore intersected with cross passages and expanded into chambers. These junctions were structurally analogous to load-bearing walls. Collapse them in the right sequence, in the right order, at the right intervals, and the intervening sections would lose their geological support and follow. The mountain would settle into its own tunnels. The sequence mattered as much as the strikes themselves. The first GBU-57 would target the northernmost junction. 45 seconds later, the second weapon would hit the next junction while the rock was still vibrating from the first impact, during what seismic modeling identified as the compressive phase, when the rock was already under abnormal stress. The compounding effect of a second strike during peak stress would amplify the structural failure far beyond what either bomb could achieve independently. The third strike would follow 50 seconds after the second, the interval adjusted for distance. The fourth and final weapon would seal the southern exits, the tunnel faces that opened toward the strait, the locations from which the TEL vehicles would emerge to launch. Geologists assigned a 73% probability to a complete tunnel collapse along the entire 19-kilometer length if all 4 weapons performed within parameters. Partial collapse, rendering at least 12 kilometers permanently unusable, was assessed at 91%. Either outcome would eliminate the facility as an operational asset for a minimum of 5 to 7 years. Both aircraft crossed into Iranian airspace from the south, over the Gulf of Oman, threading through a corridor that the opening phases of Operation Epic Fury had already stripped of air defense coverage. They flew 11 kilometers apart, close enough to maintain the sequencing timeline, far enough that their radar signatures would not compound in the event any surviving Iranian sensor was oriented in their direction. At 0351 local time, the first GBU-57 separated from the lead aircraft. 90 seconds of descent. Impact at over 1,000 feet per second. Limestone, then dolomite, then harder metamorphic rock, then detonation at the calculated depth. The blast pressure wave propagated outward in every direction through the rock. At the tunnel junction, where excavation had created open space, the wave found the path of least resistance and hammered into the void. The ceiling collapsed. The walls fragmented inward. Rock that had been stable for geological ages became debris in under a second, filling the tunnel bore for approximately 400 meters in each direction from the blast point. 45 seconds later, the second weapon struck. The compounding effect exceeded the geologists' baseline predictions. The second junction did not merely collapse. It shattered. Structural failure propagated laterally into tunnel sections that had not been targeted, as the accumulated stress from 2 sequential detonations overwhelmed the rock's capacity to maintain coherence. The third strike intensified the cascade. By that point, the mountain was no longer behaving as a stable geological structure. It was behaving as a system in cascading failure. Microfractures created by the first 2 strikes were connecting and widening under the added stress. Sections 2 kilometers from the impact point were collapsing on their own. The fourth weapon struck the southern face, sealing every identified tunnel exit toward the strait. Satellite imagery captured 12 minutes after the final strike showed a visible depression along the ridgeline above the tunnel complex. Not a Hollywood-style mountain collapse. A measurable subsidence extending for approximately 6 kilometers along the ridge. The mountain had settled into its own tunnels. 19 kilometers of infrastructure, 12 years in construction, compressed into rubble in under 4 minutes. Secondary explosions continued for hours. The Khalij Fars missiles stored in the launch preparation chambers detonated as fire and pressure reached them. Each warhead added its energy to the destruction, further pulverizing tunnel sections that had already collapsed. The facility was not damaged. It was not degraded. It was rendered geologically unrecoverable. At the National Military Command Center in the Pentagon, the battle damage assessment came in stages. Seismic data confirmed 4 successful detonations at correct depths. Satellite imagery confirmed surface subsidence. Thermal imaging confirmed internal fires. And signals intelligence confirmed the most telling indicator of all. Before the strikes, encrypted transmissions had been detected from the complex at regular intervals through every 24-hour period. After 03:55 local time, there was nothing. Not reduced communications. Not emergency traffic.
Total silence.
The kind of silence that doesn't come from damage. The kind that comes from the absence of anything left to transmit from. Iran's public response followed the pattern that had become familiar since the operation began. State media characterized the strikes as ineffective. Military officials appeared on television claiming critical assets had been relocated before the attack. Supreme leader statements described the resilience of the Islamic Republic. None of this was true. The Iranian leadership knew it wasn't true. Every intelligence service of consequence knew it wasn't true. But the statements served their domestic purpose, temporarily. The problem with maintaining a false narrative about military capability is that the narrative eventually collides with observable reality. Ships that should be on patrol are not. Missile tests that should be conducted are not. Resupply convoys that should be moving are not. Within 72 hours of the Hormozgan strikes, Iranian engineering teams were dispatched to the site to assess the damage. American surveillance drones monitored the roads in real time. The assessment teams arrived.
They surveyed. They left. No bulldozers followed. No boring machines. No concrete trucks. The teams came, looked at what remained, and departed. The absence of reconstruction equipment was its own intelligence product. It told a story no state media broadcast could revise. The IRGC attempted to position replacement missile systems at alternate locations along the coast. 3 truck-mounted launcher convoys were identified and tracked as they moved from central Iran toward Hormozgan province. 2 were struck by precision-guided munitions launched from carrier-based aircraft in the Gulf of Oman.
The third reached its destination, a hastily prepared open-air firing position on a hillside overlooking the strait, and was destroyed within 4 hours of arrival. The message was the same one delivered at every other recovery attempt during the operation. Reconstruction is a target. Reconstitution is a target. The equipment you use to rebuild will be destroyed alongside the thing you are trying to rebuild. The financial markets registered what had happened before the diplomatic community did. Oil futures, which had spiked sharply in the opening days of the conflict, began a sustained decline within 48 hours of the Hormozgan strikes. The risk premium that had been embedded in oil prices for decades, the premium that reflected the permanent possibility that Iran might physically close the strait, began to evaporate. Insurance rates for tanker transits, climbing since the conflict began, reversed course. The maritime industry's collective judgment, expressed not in diplomatic statements but in the hard arithmetic of premiums and futures contracts, was that the threat had been neutralized. That risk premium had affected every barrel of oil that passed through the strait, roughly 21 million barrels per day. By extension, it had affected the energy costs of every nation on Earth that depended on Gulf crude. Removing it represented a transfer of economic value measured in billions of dollars annually. It appeared on no battle damage assessment. It showed up in no satellite imagery. But it was real, and it was immediate. For defense ministries studying the operation from the outside, the Hormozgan strikes demanded a fundamental reassessment of assumptions that had been held for decades. Individual bunker-busting attacks on single underground chambers were well understood. The ability to collapse 19 kilometers of interconnected tunnels with 4 weapons, using geological mechanics as a force multiplier, turning the mountain itself into the primary destructive instrument, that was not. North Korea's underground nuclear facilities bored into granite mountains had been considered beyond the reach of conventional weapons. The Hormozgan precedent introduced uncertainty into that assessment. China's submarine base at Yulin, carved into coastal rock, had been considered invulnerable to anything short of nuclear attack. The sequence collapse technique, applied to the right geological stress points with sufficient targeting data, introduced uncertainty there too. The lesson was not about penetration depth alone. It was about geology. A tunnel is only as strong as its weakest section. A mountain is only impregnable if its internal structure is uniform and competent at every depth. Nature rarely cooperates with that assumption. Fault lines, water-bearing strata, variations in rock density, zones of weathering and alteration at different depths, all of these create potential failure points that a detailed enough survey can identify and a precise enough weapon can exploit. Iran learned this at Hormozgan. The question facing every nation with underground military infrastructure is whether they will adapt accordingly, or whether they will make the same bet Iran made, that depth alone equals safety, and wait to discover that it does not. The strait reopened to full commercial traffic within 10 days. The first tanker to transit was a Liberian-flagged very large crude carrier carrying Saudi crude from the Ras Tanura terminal to refineries in South Korea. Its passage was uneventful. No radar locks. No fast boat harassment. No launch warnings. The waterway that had been the most contested choke point in global energy commerce for an entire generation was, for the first time in decades, genuinely quiet. Not the quiet before something. The quiet of absence. The quiet of a threat that no longer exists because the infrastructure that supported it lies compressed under 6 kilometers of subsided ridgeline, and the missiles that gave the threat its teeth are now fragments distributed through 19 kilometers of collapsed rock. $12 billion. 12 years. 4 minutes. This is a speculative scenario. Real weapon systems, platforms and strategic doctrines are referenced throughout, but the events depicted are entirely fictional. If you enjoyed this video, check out our other video on the US Air Force's campaign against Iran's nuclear supply chain. Bye for now.